Welcome everyone to LowCodeCon 2022. My name is Michael Cares and I'm your host. We're celebrating our second year with this global event focused on all things low code and open source. Our purpose is to bring together the low code and open source community to share the experience and knowledge of thought leaders and experts from around the world. As the host company and organizer of the event, AOT Technologies is committed to the values of low code and open source. So much so that we developed our own free open source low-code development platform, formsflow.ai, which is core to our strategic vision and democratized development of government and business. I'd like to introduce to you today's speaker, Zach Woodward, who is presenting today on teaching the public sector about open source, low code, and no code. Zach is the VP of Digital Transformation at AOT Technologies, and he's spent the last 14 years supporting the public sector both in Canada and abroad. Just before joining the AOT team as the VP Digital Transformation Services, he worked in the BC government as the Senior Director, IMIT Procurement and Service Design, where he helped to champion open source and digital development procurement through the creation of Sprint with Us, Code with Us, and the Procurement Concierge. Zach now leads the public sector engagements for AOT, supporting the global public sector audience needs for digital innovation and modernization, utilizing his experience in open source development and agile product management. Over to you, Zach.
Thank you there, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're located. So give me just one moment. I'm just going to pull up my slide deck here so that we'll be able to go through this presentation together. Okay. Hopefully that is displaying for everyone.
We can see it, Zach.
You can see it, but unfortunately I'm unable to switch slides. So we are stuck only on the main slide here. Interesting. So, well, I'll talk through this for a moment while I'm trying to get this all started up. So hello, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Zach Woodward. And over the last 14 years, I've worked in consulting and in the public sector across the Netherlands, Belgium, down in South America, specifically in Peru, and then most recently with the BC government. In these spaces, I was supporting out with a number of different engagements across the universities in and across Europe, to direct engagement in the financial models being supported out across Peru, and then with the BC government more specifically focused on procurement modernization and procurement engagement when it came to supporting out our vendor engagement, our vendor interaction, and just how we structured those types of models across this province. Apologies, I'm just needing to try and figure out how I can share this so I can switch slides. Why it is being difficult, I can't understand. Richard, are you able to take control of the screen and move to the next slide at all? Or anything?
I don't have access to your slide deck. You can link me to your slide deck and I can share it from there.
Again, apologies everyone for this slight delay. Let's see. There we go. Did it all just switch?
That's got it, yeah.
Excellent.
We got it.
Okay, there we go. Apologies. You'd think for somebody who works in a technology company, he'd be better at using technology. All right, moving on from that. So today's session is really going to be focusing on what does it mean for us to be able to engage in that conversation with the public sector, be it here in Canada, across Europe, South America, wherever you may be. I'm going to be trying to bring a lot of that experience that I've had over the last better part of 15 years now to engage in that conversation. And hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have an understanding a little bit about what are the key challenges facing the public sector and what does it mean for us to be able to be a part of that conversation, an educational resource for them, and driving forward the behaviors and experiences that we want that public sector to be able to understand, to be involved in, not only so that we as potentially vendors or clients with them are able to engage in those conversations, but also so that us as citizens are able to benefit from the experience that government is now being able to present to us, because they have a strategic and goal-oriented approach to how they're going to be able to deliver on many of these mandates and services that have been identified over the years. So moving on from there now, we're going to take a moment here to just kind of walk everyone through what is the standard public sector process for actually getting a project launched. And understand that this is not specifically to the BC government. This is just public sector in general. And I've seen this all around the world. So it's very important that we recognize that these challenges are not just one-off. They're a very common challenge experienced by so many public sector bodies and happen on the regular. So first off, we have to consider the business case. So what has happened? We'll say a minister has released a mandate or an event has happened where we need to be able to respond in a hurry. We need to be able to engage in that conversation. We've identified to the citizens, we know there's a weakness here, we know there's a gap, and we want to make that upgrade. So they start to work on their business case. And they've identified the staff that are going to do this. They start to do their requirements gathering. They write the business case, and then they edit it and rewrite and do that over and over again until they get it to that finished state. This can take anywhere from around 6 months to a year. So it's taken a little bit of time, but they have that business case now. They have a solid plan for how they want to deliver that service. So then we move on to the second step. The business case has been approved. This is great news. Now it's time to go get the funding to be able to actually implement this program, this project, this service. So they start their finance request. Now, if this is something that was planned and already on the books, then great. They might already have operational dollars to support this. But if this is something where it was unexpected, perhaps it's something that spans multiple years and is going to take a more significant oversight of those financial dollars and that spend, well, now you have to engage with your treasury board or with your Ministry of Finance equivalent to be able to understand, okay, what is it going to mean for us to be able to get these approvals? What does it mean for us to have perhaps multi-million-dollar projects, funding over multiple years to be able to engage on this service? We have to beg, plead, borrow, and steal across all of these different resources. And sometimes that means that they're also working with the vendor community to understand with perhaps architects or people of that nature to be able to go, how can you help us explain what it is we need? So then we have the public sector involved in that side of the conversation, while the private sector is trying to teach them about what their business case is calling for. Finally, after perhaps 6 months, a year, perhaps even longer, depending on the difficulty or the challenge of the project, the financials are approved for this file. So at this point, we could be anywhere from a year to a year and a half before we have finance approval from when we first started our business case. Then we get to start our procurement. We have our funding, we have our business case, everything's in alignment. So we go into that and we start to do our requirements gathering, meeting with users, meeting with the citizens to be able to understand what is it's needed in that space. We're engaging with the stakeholders and we're all a part of that conversation, be it vendors, citizens, or the public sector. It's the universal we at this point. We're all a part of this conversation to be able to help the government get to that stage of having a posted opportunity. Now, this is a very significant window here where I've seen procurements that can be done in just a few weeks, all the way up to procurements that have taken multiple years, 2-3 years to be able to be completed and signed to a contract. So this could mean from where we started with our business case to this point now, we could be anywhere from 2.5 years, all the way up to maybe 4 or 5 years since when the problem was first identified to when we actually have posted the opportunity saying we have a plan on how we're going to solve for it. The opportunity gets posted, opportunity closes, vendors have applied, they get to evaluate and they get to sign their contract. This is generally a very small window. Maybe it's a few weeks to a few months, but generally speaking, it's a fairly small window. And then things start to go wrong. The contract gets signed. We realize that when we first identified our business case to when we got the procurement out the door, we're looking at 3 years, 5 years, maybe more. What technology hasn't changed in the span of 3 to 5 years? The contract perhaps is pointing in the wrong direction. The use cases in the business case are identifying requirements and needs that no longer exist or have changed due to the change of need in the environment. So public sector generally finds themselves in a problem here because this process doesn't allow for a realignment of those resources. Contracts don't allow for a realignment of resources. That's the nature of a contract. You know, go and try and renegotiate your phone bill. Go and try and renegotiate your television subscription model or whatever it is. They're just going to laugh you out and say, no, that's our contract. You signed it. Have a great day. Well, what do we do in this space? We're stuck in these systems that have been established for years. And it's not to say that these systems aren't there for a purpose, but they haven't modernized in the same manner, in the same way that the marketplace has. It hasn't modernized in the same way that the private sector has been able to get involved in the conversation. And so we find that a lot of these things end up forcing the public sector down the wrong path, or it forces the vendors to support an approach that no longer makes sense. This is a critical thing that we need to identify when it comes to the private sector and citizens engaging in those conversations with the public sector. Is what can we do to strategically keep those doors opened, keep the conversation available at all times? Do not refine what our needs are to the contract. Do not refine what our needs are to the procurement, but refine what our needs are as something that will evolve over time, something that can be engaged in the conversation and can change day to day as we identify the nuances that are in the technological space, the nuances that are all across the province, all across the provinces, the country, the world, wherever it is that you're being engaged from. So as I was saying, you know, in a best case scenario, you're looking at 2-ish, maybe 3 years. Worst case scenario, you're probably well over 4 years. And in a technological environment, that simply doesn't make sense. You know, we consider back to 4 years ago, well, that was 2018. That simply, like, none of my phones are that old. None of my computer is that old anymore. Like, that technology changes in such a drastic way that to consider that you have 4 years from when you first started your business case to solve a problem to when you're finally getting a contract to start solving the problem. That's the important part in this. This isn't 4 years or 5 years and the problem is solved. This is only 4 to 5 years, and then you get to start to implement your solution. That's a really long time to wait, a really long time to be able to engage with the citizens, engage with the vendors, and be able to demonstrate that you are an exciting and you know, evolution government that is going to be responsive to the needs of the day. But that's not to, you know, hang this all on the public sector. Let's recognize where some of the responsibility lies here, and that's with the private sector as well. We have a responsibility to be able to be engaging in this conversation, to be teaching and training and educating the public sector on ways that we can help them be better, help to engage with us. And that's really where we see the open source opportunities, the low code and no code opportunities. That's where we can see real tangible benefits to be able to encourage the public sector to be more involved and more engaged in today's conversation. So what does this mean for us? It often means when we have these types of processes that government ends up being a little bit more risk averse, because if they make a bad decision early on, that will trickle down all the way through the procurement and through the treasury funding and the business case, and inevitably result in a contract that didn't get what they needed. So as a result, there's a preference towards those safe options. And unfortunately, due to what can really arguably be said, just bad publicity or perhaps even nefarious publicity, open source has typically been given this bad light of being something that you can't really trust or you can't really engage in. It's created these small siloed plans where technology development across public sectors, generally they don't talk to each other. Two different areas in the same government could be doing the exact same thing, and they don't let each other know. They don't rely on each other to benefit the overarching goals. Instead, what ends up happening is one branch or one division does it themselves, another branch, another division does it as well, and they don't have any sort of opportunity for cost reduction or to expedite the service delivery. Instead, they're doing it completely remotely from each other. And there's a lot of assumptions when it comes to technology as well. One of the biggest things that we see is that a lot of areas talk about how they operate with agility. They understand that our division, our ministry, our government is an agile government. But we also have to consider the fact that agile is almost 30 some odd, like 35 years old now. We're not talking about a brand new technique that's super cutting edge. We're talking about something that originated in the late 80s, early 90s. That was when it was really kind of building out its framework. So there's a lot of assumptions in technology about how the public sector can be involved in these conversations, not realizing that even with the more modern approaches that are being engaged in today, many of those have been around for a decade or two as a common focus for the private sector. And that's where a challenge really lies for the public sector versus private sector conversation. And I don't want to say versus, but in this nature, it really is that the citizens, especially becoming experienced to the private sector responsiveness versus the public sector developing responsiveness. And that creates this weird dynamic, this push and pull that really becomes a significant challenge for us, especially as private sector entities, when it comes to how can we support this conversation? How can we engage in making the public sector better for us as vendors and better for us as citizens? Sorry, just might be sneezing. Nope, I'm not. Okay, moving on from there. So we need to consider, how do we treat this? And we treat this through digital leadership and governance, recognizing that we have a responsibility, both as members of society and part of this conversation, as well as people that want to be able to be in relationship with government, not just as a fiduciary relationship through a contract or something like that, but in a relationship knowing that the services that they provide today are going to make it better for the next generation. It's going to make it better for our children. And so how can we ensure that we are putting our best foot forward so that they are able to deliver those services down the road? There's the understanding of, what does open source strategy mean? And we see it across all of Canada. Every single province right now has their own open source strategy or an open government strategy that they're beginning to implement and considering the different impacts in this space. Well, we have a responsibility in that as well. What can we be doing as vendors to be able to educate and train, make it clear that open source and low code and no code are viable techniques that have been around and have been tried, tested, and true to the nature of business, the nature of these operations, and what does it mean to be able to support out this type of work? And we also have to consider the human-centered approach. So one of the biggest impacts that we find, especially in the technological space, and I know that if there's any user experience or user research people that are listening to this, you'll instantly understand and relate to what I'm about to say. But it is the idea that as a technology person myself, when I build things so that I can use them. And that is the wrong approach. We need to make sure that we are engaged in a conversation that takes into consideration every citizen, every member of our society at whichever level they may be. We have to consider, what does it mean for people that have disabilities and need accessibility options? We need to understand, what does it mean for my grandmother who does not have a smartphone, who doesn't have any of those technologies, who just wants to be able to make a request of government for her medication, or make a request to government in regards to registering a pet or something of that nature. We need to be able to make sure that we're engaging in those conversations so that all people are being engaged, all people understand how to be engaged. And we don't start developing a government, we don't start developing our public sectors in a way that are not going to be responsive to the nature of the people that they serve. And as the private sector, we often are driven towards bigger, faster, fancier. We really want to show out the new technologies, the new techniques, the shiny, whichever it may be that we're involved in, industry dependent. And sometimes that means that we're actually leaving people behind. One of the key things, and I'll bring this up in just a second here, is something that we've probably all forgotten about. But this is what PowerPoint used to look like. This is what used to be cutting edge technology. This used to be a browser that everyone had on their computer. Oh, look at Netscape there. That's shiny. Everyone used to have this type of thing going on. Look, it's great. Oh, it's the best. Now, granted, this was back in 1996, but we often have an issue of losing that focus, losing that level of engagement, and we don't recognize what those impacts are. We don't recognize how far the story has gone, and what does it mean for us to go, hey, government, what can we be doing to be supporting you? What can we be doing to be engaging in this story? How can we make you better? How can we take you from your Netscape technologies, your 1990s PowerPoints, up to 2022. And it's not to say that the public sector is trapped in 30-year-old technology, but it is to understand that even in some cases, 5-year-old technology is struggling and is creating those technical debts or is creating those deficiencies within the system that we simply need to be aware of. So in government, they need to determine what we need to do. And I want to point out, I've really stolen a few slides from old PowerPoint right now, just to really hammer home. Oh, come on, work with me here. Dang it, apologies. Just to really hammer home how much technology has changed. Like, this is all old PowerPoint font. There is old images in this. And I really wanted to capture just how much things have changed. When I did my first degree, this is the PowerPoint that I used, or this is the style of PowerPoint that I used. But we need to recognize, what does it mean for us to be able to engage in these conversations and recognize that the government has been around for decades and decades. And many of us in the vendor world are only considering the last couple of years of technological impact, of technological advancement. And we're not considering the fact of, well, what did it mean for the government to be bringing on computers in the 70s? What did it mean for them to be implementing COBOL to run their financial systems? We only think about, well, what is the website interaction looking like? What does it mean for us to be able to just click on a thing and we get the application we need, or click on this thing and it changes the font so that I can see it because I maybe am red, green, deficient with my eyes, or whichever that may be. So we have to understand, what does government need to be able to understand? How do they need to be able to determine the best ways forward? What are the best technologies that they need to be able to solve for the problems of the day? And how do they go from being the agencies that brought technology to the public sector and to the citizens in the 70s and 80s and 90s, when for the most part, most of us as vendors don't have to worry about that dead weight, don't need to worry about that part of the conversation, but we should. So what is currently being tested across the public sector environments around the world? Commonly we're seeing right now is the common components approach. Now, this is a viable opportunity for us to be able to be supporting out our public sectors. We can see that they want to do this. They want to have a repository of all of the different technologies that they're using, the different code bases, the different applications that they've used, so that they can reuse code in different areas and different models. But there's a key challenge with this. One, you need to have somebody who's going to take care of your common components. They always need to be updated and upgraded over time. But also, you kind of need a librarian of your common components. You need a digital librarian who's going to come along and go, I know where all the tech is, I know what all the different tech types are, and I know that when a project gets started, what components of this different tech would be best used to be able to support out their efforts. That creates a lot of dependencies on the common components work that we're seeing only just getting started in the public sector. This is a key challenge for a lot of the work that they're doing in this space, because common components is generally only showing up after a whole bunch of tech has already been built. So we actually have the cart driving the horse in this, because instead of coming up with a common component strategy and creating a catalog from the early days, what we actually have is a bunch of tech that has already been built, and then somebody needs to come along afterwards and go, oh, this is something that we should have done 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but now we need to get caught up with all of the work that's already happened. We also see a lot of work going on in open repositories. At my last count, when I was with the BC government, the GitHub repos that were being used, I believe it was somewhere around a count of 900 different repositories supporting out digital services across the province. And again, this points back to that need for that digital librarian. Somebody who understands where all the repositories are, has created cataloging and a searchable method for us to be able to engage in those different tools, understand what they're providing, and perhaps how we can piecemeal use components of it or containers and bring them along with us to be able to support out future growth and future development. And then there's also, and this is one of the most key things here, is the public-facing digital policies. And this is really where the private sector needs to get involved. This is where we can provide that education, that guidance in that direction, because this is actually the thing that should have come first. This is the carrot that should have been in front of the horse that should have been driving the cart. But instead, we see that common components led the open repositories, which then leads the strategies. We need to get these digital policies earlier on, understanding what are the digital policies that are currently being engaged across some of the key companies in this space. What is Amazon and Microsoft and Google doing in the cloud space? And how do those policies affect the public sector? What is happening in the open source? And who are the key players in open source around the world who are driving open source challenges? No, I know in particular when it came to the BC government, one of the key leads that we looked to was the UK government. They were keenly focused on what was it going to mean to do agile open source practices. And it was a key driver for a lot of the work that we did with the OCIO and the BC Developers Exchange. These are critical things that need to happen on a world stage. And it's important for us to understand what those challenges are going to mean for the public sector, because we deal with this every single day. They deal with this only when the urgency comes up. And so it's important for us to be there to hold their hand, to train, teach, educate, whatever we can do to support out their growth and their understanding in this space. So when we consider some of the standard challenges that the public sector faces in this, is that there's those out-of-date funding models. When it takes a year, year and a half to be able to get funding for your project, that is a key challenge for the public sector being able to be responsive, to be able to show that they are keenly focused on the needs of the citizens. We need to make sure that there are technology isn't driving the strategy, that strategy drives the technology. So when government goes, you know, we're going to do this, we're going to use open source, or we're going to use low code, or we're going to use this particular platforms for something, that there is a strategy behind why they're doing that. And that strategy is going to be conducive across the ministries, across the province, across the provinces, whichever that face value may be for your particular, either be it municipal or provincial or state governments. It's critical to be able to understand that the strategy needs to be in place to be able to drive that behavior across the public sector. And then there's also that misrepresentation of what kind of resources are available. The struggle with the misrepresentation of what was open source. For years, open source was seen as something that's like, oh, you know what, it's not safe, you shouldn't touch it. But that simply wasn't a viable reality of open source. It was entirely safe. It just was a better speaking point for those in the private sector who weren't prepared to adopt open source approaches. So instead, they used their power and influence to suggest that open source wasn't a viable option. When we consider the actual needs across public sector, we have to recognize that there is, in the low code and the no code space, who are we driving towards? If you're in a tech-centric public sector environment, then low code is a viable option. You will need some developers, but you'll have that rapid deployment of services. You'll be able to engage in a lot of the technical needs in a rapid approach that supports the citizens' needs, that supports that minister mandate, that supports the funding models of a lot of these agencies. We have to consider, what does that mean for the coding challenges in this space? Well, if it's low code, that means that you've already created a conducive environment where you're not going to need a lot of coders, a lot of developers to work in this space. And I can speak fairly confidently across the western coast here along the Pacific Ocean. Developers are hard to come by, and they come at a high price point. So what can we do to mitigate some of those challenges that we experience in that space? We have to consider, what does it mean for customization? In almost every procurement I've ever run, especially in the IT space, if government buys a COTS solution, it already has to be customized. They never get a COTS solution that meets 100% of their requirements. I'd say on average, it was maybe 70%. But that means that immediately upon buying a thing, it already isn't good enough. So what can we do to respond with things that are customizable or things that are templated in a way that is easily consumable by our public sector? What does it mean for us to understand how they can create things themselves without the need for full stack developers with 15 years of experience? What does it mean for a business analyst or just somebody who's even technologically interested to be able to be involved in creating simple and decisive solutions for citizen engagement? We have to consider what does the low code and no code opportunities present in this public sector space, knowing that across all of government, there's one tool and one tool only that you can say everyone knows and uses, and that's Excel. But that is one of the key ways that we lose data, that we lose an understanding of the transition and flow of information throughout the public sector. And so what can we do to be able to suggest new techniques, new simple technologies to be able to engage with all of the users, keep them involved in the conversation, and ensure that there's no one left behind, that no one sees these new tools and new technologies as scary or challenging or anything of that nature. They see it as something where anyone within the public sector can be involved in the conversation. Anyone within the private sector can be an educator or a supporter, and anyone who is a citizen can be reliant and perhaps expectant that the services that they're seeking are going to be readily available and easy for them to be able to consume. So with all of this, there's a couple of ways, and I'm really going to try and wrap up to the key point here of how can we, with all the information I've just talked about, engage in this conversation? How can we help our public sector understand what's happening right now? And by and large, this is what the public sector has identified have been the key challenges when trying to engage with in the conversation, either with the private sector or with citizens. What the public sector hears is that things cost too much. It's too much for private sector to be involved in the conversation. The public sector it's difficult. It's very nuanced, and there's a lot of challenging areas that we just don't really understand when we're general citizens or private sector. Often when we go to developing out a service, it has to go through the procurement process, and that procurement takes too long. If you go back to the beginning of this presentation, as I kind of demonstrated with the business case to finance to procurement workflow, we were looking at 2 to 4+ years of time to be able to be involved in those conversations. Well, most phones these days only last 2 years. Most services that we're running are going to have been modernized time and time and time again between day 1 and 2 years later. The idea that just having a business case and that you're going to get that service at the end of 2 years almost seems mind-boggling when you think of it from a citizen perspective of going, but I need a service today. So, and also recognizing that the public sector is looking for ways to be able to engage in this. They're looking for ways and supports from the private sector to be able to modernize, to be able to be involved in that conversation. But they also identify that they've got a lot of work. The private sector is busy. They're working with other clients, they're working with citizens, they're doing all of these different types of projects that are already involved in. And if the public sector doesn't know what they're looking for, or doesn't have a proactive vendor or citizen engagement to be able to help them be proactive, to help them be more understanding of the nuances of technology or the nuances of service delivery, then we're always going to be kind of behind the 8 ball. We're always going to be watching as our public sector is responding to the problem that rather than being proactively engaged in that conversation. So we need to make sure that we are engaged in that and that we are teaching them in every opportunity that we can. So that brings to mind the ideas of how can we make the conversation simple? How can we make the conversations easy to consume across low code, no code, across open source, across procurement, across all of these different services that are being asked for on a daily basis? And what can we do to ensure that our needs, not just as public sector, not just as private sector, but truly as the citizens that are going to be reliant on the delivery of these services, those things are cost effective, They are responsive to the needs of today, and they'll enable the government to be able to respond more efficiently in the future. So we do have to consider, what does it take? And I just wanted to kind of wrap up on the three big things here. What does it take for us as private sector to be a part of this conversation? And it's recognizing that every province has an open source strategy. Be involved in those conversations. That is paramount to ensuring that you have a responsive and responsible public sector. Recognizing that, across Canada in particular, our federal government has been leading open source strategies for years now. They've been deploying services like Scale Up in particular. It's a fantastic way to be able to support out that early engagement, support out those small procurements, support out that small service delivery that is responsive to the day-to-day needs of citizens. And in particular, I'd like to point out the Australian government's work with their procurement portal, and recognizing that they built that with open source technologies. This is their primary way of being able to engage with the public sector, engage with the private sector, and engage with their citizens to be able to explain what they're buying and how they're going to buy it and how they're going to deliver on the mandates and service requirements of the day. And it was built entirely in open source. That is such a critical understanding of the work that's going on in this space and what it can mean for us as we evolve and continue to go forward. So with that, I really just want to challenge everybody at the end here. When you are engaged in these conversations, when you want to be supporting out your public sector and supporting out the work that goes on there, every RFI that gets posted, request for information, is an opportunity for you to be able to speak to your public sector and educate them, to support them, to make them bigger, better, faster, stronger. Every time that you're seeing a new minister mandate, or you're seeing something hit the newspaper that is talking about how the public sector is going to respond to something, look to see how you, either as a citizen or as the private sector, can engage yourselves in those conversations and support out the work that's going on there. Open source, low code, those new technologies, we see that happening all across the board at all times. But more often than not, what we see is the public sector struggling to adopt, struggling to adapt, and struggling to engage in the 2022 version of those conversations and soon to be 2023 versions of those conversations, when we're still seeing those funding models and those procurement models and those business case models pulling the public sector behind, so that they're never quite able to catch up with all of the nuances and the new opportunities that we have today. So with that, I'm going to stop there and turn it over. I believe it's going back to Michael or over to Richard.
To myself. Thank you, Zach, very much for that. Very much appreciated for your insights from the many years working in the public sector. I do have one question that's come up from the group today. Any recommended techniques on how to encourage the public sector to engage in these conversations?
See, this is a great question, and it's an interesting challenge that's dependent upon the types of ministries that you're involved in. It depends on the type of work that you support out as a private sector or as a citizen, engaging with that conversation. But knowing that your public sector is constantly trying to evolve, they're constantly trying to understand what are the nuances and the opportunities available out in the market today, we need to recognize that some of the things that we're involved in, especially at a conference like this, low code in particular, this has only been around, like low code as a known entity, a known title, I believe it was June 2014. It's not something that's been around for a long period of time. And there's not a lot of companies that are really striving through this marketplace yet. So it means that there's opportunity for us to be able to speak to them, to engage in that. But it does mean that as a private sector, we have to be proactive. We can't wait for the public sector to issue out their procurements. Once that's happened, it's too late. The procurement's already been put out there, and they've already told us what they need and how we're going to do it. Instead, as a private sector, we need to get to them before that happens. We need to make sure that the executives and the product owners and those project managers that are out there today, the ones that are going to be starting that business case and understanding that work, are aware of the options. We need to engage in those RFIs. I know that there's no money necessarily in an RFI itself, but the opportunity to make sure that your government is bigger, better, faster, stronger earlier on is going to support you as a vendor and you as a citizen far more effectively and far more efficiently than waiting until the procurement comes out and then trying to correct things after the fact.
Thank you, Zach. We don't have any more questions, so I want to thank you for your time today. Appreciate your energy and enthusiasm and experience and sharing it with everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We do invite you to our next session at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Keep in mind, we have 3 sessions every day, morning, noon, and 3 p.m., and we're getting invites sent to you from Zoom for all of those sessions. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have yourselves a great day.